I think there's two broad shifts that, in our view, agent centricity is bringing. And this is, I would say it's controversial because I think agent centricity is such a wild roller coaster ride that you can pretty much develop your own interpretation of it, right? And so I think a sign of evolution is diversity. And I think Holochain has now evolved to that place where people, you start seeing different interpretations of agent centricity and different approaches towards things. And so within Holochain, you'll find there's a group of people who align with the modularity way of thinking, which is super exciting for me because I think agent centricity is taking us towards a Lego block approach. So if I was to create a Facebook in the centralized tech paradigm, I would have to build everything from the identity layer to the data layer to the AI layer, like all of it, like the entire stack. And so you have these various very fat silo-like stacks that are quite monolithic. But in agent centricity, I think we start sharing infrastructure, which means if you're an entrepreneur trying to build some kind of social network, you actually don't have to build that entire stack. You can just be very clever and borrow over what someone else has built. So you can actually borrow reputational infrastructure, REA's monetary infrastructure, someone else's identity infrastructure. And so I think it's changes the way we build on, build applications and networks, which is super exciting. And I think that meta shift is we might be moving towards neighborhoods as an organizing principle, but I don't know. We can get into that if we have some time later. But to summarize it, I would say is what we're building is the central piece of what we're building is known as the reputation vault. And so that's kind of the dashboard for every agent, for every person as they hop from community to community or even engage within the community to navigate and be in control of their reputation data as they're moving from network to network. But more importantly, they can also, as they're about to engage with people, they can also, view that person, like, who is David? Does he volunteer at his organic farm on Saturdays? Does he also love these kinds of films? And so it unlocks these new kinds of interactions with us. So that's the reputation vault. And then there's these Lego blocks called libraries. And there's an actual, what we're developing is a language, like an actual domain specific language for cultural articulation. I'll talk about that as well. So the reputation libraries, I mean, again, think of them as little blocks. Some of them are powered by REA accounting. And so with the Economic Ed Alliance, which has been been put together by a few people within Holochain, we've been building these little Lego blocks that can just be plugged in to existing applications or communities. So if you're a Junto, just yesterday we had an interesting chat with Junto, and instead of, what they would love to do is let their communities or groups swap out likes for claps or maybe upvotes and downvotes. And so they don't actually have to design that within their stack. They just pop in and plug our little Lego blocks. And I think that's super important because if you're looking for that cultural diversity, that's where we need to go, because a Facebook won't let you do that. A Facebook's going to impose its own cultural architecture on you, and their cultural template is how can we maximize eyeballs? How can we, we don't care if you're watching cat videos or any other content. And so, which is why they'll impose that cultural template on you. So some of these are on our GitHub repo. And so, yeah, I would recommend going and checking some of them out. If there's people out there who are passionate about building this, now's a good time to join in. The DSL for cultural articulation is it's kind of like we want to make it as simple as popping into a spreadsheet and saying and defining what you think is punctuality or not for your community or neighborhood. So you don't actually have to write big lines of code, but you can actually say, if timestamp less than this, then not punctual, And so the DSL makes it as easy as that. It's that binding glue that makes all of this articulation come alive. And so it could be, you could define punctuality as a binary, it could be a spectrum, it could be a star rating. You could apply all kinds of distribution curves. There's a bunch of animations, but I don't think we'll get into that. Like it could be, and so distribution curves also let you modulate culture in a more meaningful way. And so Bosby and Michael Hushin are some of the people building this DSL. But that's the dream, like for it to be that easy. So anyone who's putting together a group, maybe it's David trying to create a group about what does masculinity mean in today's world, and you want to architect and create your little cultural score for your social network. And so for you to actually be able to play with it and iterate it and swap out Lego blocks, that's what's critical. So with these two aspects, what you see is like there's all of these reputation currencies being generated, but there's a central issue with this in that the reputation currency stays locked within an existing app or within an existing neighborhood. And it's really important for David to be able to port those reputation currencies from one app or one silo to another. And that's where the reputation vault comes in, because as you pop into a new community and that community requests reputation data, you actually have agency over how that new community views you. So maybe you want to port reputation from multiple communities, so you actually hold that agency over it. So in this case, neighborhood A is computing your score with reputation data from multiple communities, and that's possible because of the vault. And so in the long run, this connects with my larger vision for reputation to be made scalable. Because one of the problems with reputation has been that it's often restricted to a context. But with agent-centric technologies and with some, consent-driven tech like reputation vaults, you can actually potentially port them to different contexts through what we call mimetic bridges. And I think this is really important, again, in a meta conversation sometime, because one of the criticisms of distributed networks and why distributed, like the world is literally burning down, we're facing large-scale global calamities, and you're talking about distributed networks. Like that makes no sense. Like we actually need, UN-style coordination. And so I actually think the answer to some of these global problems lies in building solutions through mimetic bridges as opposed to consensus. So I think that's an interesting role that the reputation vault plays. So what does that mean? It means reputation starts becoming this really fluid but utilitarian fluid indicator that we can play with. So is David punctual? There's no absolute answer to that. It's a function of what context you're asking that situation in. And I think that's really important, because reputation done outside of this just becomes very meaningless. It's almost like an Uber rating, right? Like how meaningless some of that is. And so what do we do with scalable reputation? I think it starts letting us move towards neighborhoods-like structures, like new organizing principles. So I think in the past, for the last 50 or 70 years, we've had businesses as organizing principles. Like Facebook is an example of generic culture-specific tools. Like Facebook will impose its culture on you. But with neighborhoods, you can actually start forming your micro networks and fragmented little pools of people. But each community can actually spin up tools for their purpose. So maybe our community for conversation needs Reddit-like tools and Instagram-like tools. And so we can actually spin out these clones that are contextualized for our use case. So again, I think that's why modular tech is really important. So I'd say for people who are interested in this, I'd recommend going over to our Git book. There's a bunch of this articulated, and we're also going to be talking about it quite a bit. But what we're also doing is inviting app creators who align with and also who want to build really slim stacks for them to start playing with this and figuring out how they can benefit and get away with doing really little. Is my conversation to them. I don't know if you want to get into this, but there's this interesting conversation around what you can do with scalable reputation. But potentially, if you're a community and you want to broaden the pool of members but are really worried about diluting the culture, you can actually say, okay, I'm a community A, and I think members of community B are actually relevant to me and contextually related. We can actually throw open our reputation score to also include reputation community B members, and so all of a sudden you can expand your pool without diluting culture. And I think that leads to situations or social networks where you're not entering communities as a stranger. Like when I sign up on Telegram today, I show up as a stranger, like a blank slate. And that's really silly because I might have spoken with David on WhatsApp or on Facebook and on Twitter, but I can't port my context with me. And so as a result of that, we're left with Telegram having to use AI to engage me and suggest users and screen me if I'm an idiot. But instead, if I could just port my reputation with me, I show up. It's like I show up at a dinner party, but I'm not a stranger. I know people from the gym and from the office, and I think that's how reality works. So I think it moves that emphasis away from centralized AI to distributed webs of social intelligence. And so there's a whole bunch of modeling that we've put up on how you can play with culture in this way. So let's say you're a community having economic discussions, and you think you need some influence of the value flows community. You can actually merge that in, or mold that in. There's some best practices put up here. There's conversations around, there's examples of how forking can be done. So let's say we're a community of memers, and I would like to fork our conversation for a specific topic, like maybe memes about Asia. um, I in the current in the current setup, I actually get excluded from the original thread, and I think that's ideally, if I'm contributing in a fork of the thread, I should also receive validation in the original thread, and so that's what this kind of bridging also achieves. You can start. I think at the longer term, you can start constructing complex cultures. Like maybe a community wants to articulate who is safe to meet for a cup of coffee. And so maybe if they have like a decent couch surfing reputation, maybe if they have a decent seed sharing or organic farming reputation, like you can actually construct complex cultures based on like much smaller cultural blocks. And so you can actually design reputation to start enabling more intimate activities. And I think that's one of my beefs with the current internet, right? Like it's fantastic for getting a ride share or getting food delivered, but it's awful to be doing anything intimate over the internet. And even though my wife and I met over the internet, I understand the irony there, but but I think there's so much more that could be possible with the internet, but it's just not a good idea right now because there's absolutely no reputational feedback loops that support this. And so this is an example of, right now we're seeing this massive monopoly in the Ubers and the Grabs and the Lyfts of the world because I think their offering is safety. If someone's behaved poorly in Uber, you know that they're going to screen them out. And it's really weird because that means, we keep relying on Uber for delivering that safety more and more. But I actually think with some of, our reputational tools, you could see that reversal back to community-based ride sharing. So maybe, my little community of Newton and Singapore here has its own little ride share. And maybe in Orchard, there's another little ride share network. And they guarantee safety because if there's bad behavior in one, it actually pings and, is echoed across networks. So again, I think that dismantles some of our dependence on massive centralized institutions for guiding reputation. And so you can start moving towards, more distributed, like fragmented fractals almost, because good behavior in one actually echoes out contextually into dozens or hundreds of others, and vice versa. Like even negative behavior can ripple out in the same way. So yeah, people can go check out some of these simulations that we put up. And our intention over the next few months is to host a bunch of hackalongs, maybe even a dev camp, so people can come forward and get their hands dirty and actually start playing with the stuff. And I think it's not all like, oh my god, cultural architecture, like it sounds super cool, but I think it's not actually, it doesn't have to be that abstract. I think it's, if you're a simple entrepreneur trying to put together some kind of offering, or if you're someone trying to drive and build a community, it's important for you to learn what shared infrastructure you can use. So, it's basically important because you don't have to go out and rebuild your stack, or don't actually have to build a fat stack. You can just borrow and get your MVP going in much smaller time frames and with much lesser effort.